Hello students, it's Professor Buscemi. I know I haven't done any videos so far, but I thought we could read a little poetry today. Give you a little poetry reading of what you've read for class and have been commenting on in discussions. So if you want to grab your poems book, to give you a little reminder, this is what we're talking about, the Seagull Book of Poems, edited by Joseph Kelly, 4th edition. And I thought I'd start with The Road Not Taken. I usually start with this poem in class because it is something that for years I've noticed students are aware of this poem, or can be, more often are aware, because it's a famous poem by a famous American poet, Robert Frost. But it's easy to misinterpret if you focus only on the last two lines. So I thought we'd take a little time to read it out loud. Listen to how it sounds, check out the stanza variation, the words. Kind of take note that the words mean what they mean, no hidden meaning or anything. This is The Road Not Taken by Robert Frost. Two roads diverged in a yellow wood, and sorry I could not travel both and be one traveler. Long I stood and looked down one as far as I could to where it bent in the undergrowth. Then took the other as just as fair, and having perhaps the better claim, because it was grassy and wanted wear, though as for that the passing there had worn them really about the same. And both that morning equally lay in leaves no step had trodden black. Oh, I kept the first for another day, yet knowing how way leads on to way, I doubted if I should ever come back. I shall be telling this with a sigh, somewhere ages and ages hence. Two roads diverged in a wood, and I took the one less traveled by, and that has made all the difference. And you can see from 1916, the poem's still with us after about 100 years, and still popular. For a pretty good reason. Let's take a look at the title. I think it's still something we can relate to. I think it's a universal idea in this poem. The road not taken, if you look at the phrasing, puts the emphasis on what did not happen. So if our attention is drawn to that title early, in The Road Not Taken, it makes us come to the poem with a certain expectation that we are looking more at what didn't happen, a little bit more anyway, than what did. And as many of you noted in our discussion on the discussion board, on Blackboard, there is a choice being made here. The speaker does have to choose which road he'll take, and he doesn't have that much to go on. So let's make some observations of the first stanza. Two roads diverged in a yellow wood. One of the things you can take a look at is, well, what is a yellow wood? What kind of road are we talking about here? So if we take a look at a word like yellow, you probably want to think, well, when do the woods look yellow? And I would say we're looking for a season, we're looking for something that can identify. So maybe the fall, the autumn. Every time we talk about seasons, we've noted this in some of the other literature, we're talking about a certain stage of life. It's not always, but you can kind of count on that as a universal way of looking at literature when seasons are mentioned. And I think that just tells us that the speaker is looking back on another stage of life from the fall or the autumn of his life. He's a little later in life as he looks back. And that tells us that the road not taken, right, is being told in reflection. It's a reflective voice. And because it's reflective and we're looking back on the fall, it maybe makes more sense that the word sorry appears. You can't really be sorry if nothing happened yet, right? And sorry I could not travel both. We've talked a lot about tone in a poem. It's the author's attitude towards something. he tells us that he's sorry. But why is he sorry? Not about the choice he made, but the fact that he could not travel both roads and be one traveler. He's sorry that he couldn't do both. And isn't that a familiar feeling when you have to make a decision? I kind of wish I could do both. So what does he do? Long I stood and looked down one as far as I could to where it bent in the undergrowth. We can look at punctuation, like we have this semicolon, we have a comma up here, we have what your book told you was enjambment, when the line moves to the next line without finishing the sentence, and even into the next stanza. I like to think of stanzas as little paragraphs in a poem. And paragraphs in prose each have their own way of organizing one main idea, right? You have a new idea, so you start a new paragraph. That's kind of what we see here. Because as we get to this stanza, the second one, after he's looked down the first one until it bent in the undergrowth instead of overgrowth, probably something like some low-growing bushes, but you can't see any further. That's as far as he can see. Probably wishes he could see more. Then took the other as just as fair meaning just as nice, they're the same, and having perhaps the better claim. Here's the first place where he says one is better than the other. Because it was grassy and wanted wear. Many of you noted that this word wanted means it was not worn, because it wanted wear. Though as for that, the passing there had worn them really about the same. We get right back to they're the same. So when we go to the third stanza, and both that morning equally lay in leaves no step had trodden black. If the leaves are not black and trodden, or meaning walked upon, he tells us that neither one had been worn more than the other, and they're really pretty much the same. So why do you take us through these stanzas to tell us, especially the second stanza where he changed his mind a few times, they're the same, they're not the same, one's better, one's less worn, actually they're both the same, and neither one had been walked on, right? Well, it gets back to tone and the way that reflective voice is looking at the experience. Oh, I kept the first for another day! Exclamation point. You want to take note of things like that. Because he can't go back. He can't take both, so he keeps one for another day. Remember, he was, as we noted up here, sorry about that. Maybe there's a regretful tone, mournful even, wish that he could do more, so he's disappointed. Yet knowing how way leans on to way, I doubted if I should ever come back. That's pretty sad if we think about it there, because if you make a decision and it has an impact, are you ever able to go back to the same point in time and make a decision differently? If you choose to go to college instead of working, could you go back and make the decision differently? Well, you couldn't go back in time. So he doesn't like that he can't do both. He would like to do both and can't do both. And he brings us into the future in the last stanza, where he says, I shall, in the future, be telling, remember that future tense of the verb, I shall be telling this, with a sigh. Why a sigh? What does a sigh indicate? Maybe I'm a little wistful and sad, or I wish I could have taken both. Somewhere ages and ages hence. Hence means in the future. It's an outdated word. Even at the time he wrote it, it was. But this is what he's going to say later. Notice that colon. He's pointing to that. I'm pointing to that colon here because a colon is an announcement that here's what I'm going to say in the future, colon. Two roads diverged in a wood, and I, long dash for a pause, I, emphasis on the I, speaker, took the one less traveled by, and that has made all the difference. He tells us this, and we know, based on stanzas 2 and 3, that this is, in fact, a lie. He's going to say this later, but was one the less traveled by? No, right? Though as for that, the passing there had worn them really about the same, and both that morning equally lay, and leaves no step had trodden black. And he has to leave one for another day. He doesn't have any way to distinguish them. He just kind of randomly picks one. And isn't that sort of how life is in many ways? Probably why this poem is still relevant. So what would the tone be? Is it regretful as he looks back on the fall of his life? That he feels sorry and wishes, in disappointment, wishes he could have done both, but he could not. So he tells something that is a nicer story, even though it's not true. Someday I'll talk about how this was the choice that made all the difference. Could it have been? Absolutely. Could he know it will be? Could he know it would be later on? No, because we can't know anything that's going to happen in the future. It's one of the reasons this poem seems a little confusing, because it's really tempting to sort of narrow it down to those last two lines. Oh, sorry about the focus there. I took the one less traveled by, and that has made all the difference. That attitude is positive. He wants to take a positive attitude. Even though he's sorry he couldn't do both, he's going to look back on it and say, I did the right thing. And we can hope with the speaker that he did do the right thing, because there is no way of knowing really what would have happened if he took the other path. And that's kind of the attitude towards life here. Let's do our best. Let's try. And maybe even tell ourselves a little story that what we did was the best thing. And we made a decision that led to a positive outcome because we did what we thought was right. Here's something to think about. I'll talk to you soon with the next poem.